Our scripture this morning is from the book of Luke. It's chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. It's funny the details you remember and the details you forget. Like, I remember that it was the Sabbath day because all the work had stopped. And everyone had gone to the temple to hear some prophet from out of town. I remember how the smell of the burnt offerings filled the air. How the charred meat mixed with the herbs mingled with the smell of the crowd. And even though that sounds like it would stink, over the years that had become kind of a nostalgic smell for me. It meant that it was a time to rest. It was a time to reconnect with God, to reconnect with the community. It was an especially large crowd. They had come to hear Jesus. So there were a lot of people who don't normally make it there that day. And I remember the sights and the sounds, but I can't for the life of me remember what he was talking about. All I remember is that he had this way of kind of speaking, a way of saying things that seemed very simple, but somehow changed everything. Anyway, I remember when I saw her. I remember thinking, why did she have to come today? She was the woman that everyone noticed, but nobody looked at. She was easy to spot in the crowd because everyone gave her a wide berth. No one wanted to touch her. Certainly no one wanted to talk to her. It made me think of the first time that I saw her when I was a little boy and I was at the market. And I said, "Mama, why is that woman bent over like that? How come nobody touches her? How come nobody talks to her?" And my mom pulled me aside and she explained that that's the kind of thing that God does to someone. That either she or her family had done something terrible. Nobody was quite sure what it was, but we knew that if she was bent over like that, if God had struck her down in that way, we knew that she had done something to earn it. And that's when my mother told me never to touch her, never to talk to her, to not even look at her. Which was easy enough because her eyes were always cast at the ground. Life was hard enough. It's hard enough to do the day-to-day, to feed the family, to make ends meet. The last thing anyone needs is her sin and her shame rubbing off on their family. So we all just stayed away. We all just gave her a wide berth, tried not to look, tried not to talk. It turned into the only time anyone ever touched her was to push her out of the way or to strike her. So, needless to say, she was easy to spot in the crowd. And all I could think was, why did you come today? It was the Sabbath. It was a time to hear preaching. It was a time to reconnect. It was a time to rest. And here she came to ruin everything, to cause a scene, to corrupt the community with her sin and her shame. And what's worse, she did it on a day when we have a guest. We have an honored prophet who has come to teach. And now, what's he going to think of us? What's he going to think of our town, of our community? What's he going to think of our people when he sees her in the middle of the crowd? As I was looking at her, I realized that Jesus had stopped talking. I realized that a silence had fallen over the crowd. And when I turned back to see what he was doing, he was looking right at her. And that's when I knew it was coming. You see, I had seen rebukings in the past. The temple authorities had this way of publicly shaming people who weren't living up to their standards. They had a way of putting unrighteousness on display, of calling out the people who had done wrong. And you would think that something like that would make you feel better for not being the subject of the shame, but it doesn't work that way. Somehow, whenever they called someone out, somehow whenever someone was shamed publicly, that shame permeates the crowd. And it's impossible to see it without feeling the shame yourself. It's almost like their shame touches something inside of me that's also a shame. And so we all knew what was coming. And we all averted our eyes and we all cringed, because we knew that the guest, the honored prophet, was about to tear this place apart. How dare she come and corrupt his teaching with her shame? And he said, "Woman, come over here." And she couldn't really see him because her eyes were always on people's feet. So she followed his voice. And as she approached, I got ready for the strike that was about to come. And she got up to him and she was looking down at his feet, and he said the strangest thing. He said, "You are set free from your ailment." I mean, how could he? How could he speak with authority on something that God had done? How in the world did he have the power to undo judgment on this woman? How dare he? Who does he think he is? How dare he set her free? And that phrase echoed in my head. Set free. And all I could think was, why did he say set free? Why didn't he say cured? Why didn't he say healed or fixed? Why didn't he say stand up? Why did he say set free? It's like he knew. It's like he knew what it was like to be her. That somehow he understood that her shame and her ailment was a prison. That her sin had separated her from everyone she knew and loved, including God. That there were literal shackles on her soul. It's like he knew. And after he said, "You're set free," he lifted up his hands and he reached out and he touched her. And he didn't push her. He didn't strike her. He didn't toss her aside. He just rested his hands on her. And he did so fearlessly. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't afraid of her sin and her shame. It's almost like he wanted it. It's almost like when he touched her, he wanted to put her shame on him. He wanted to take her sin and put it on him. And then her eyes, which were on his feet, always on people's feet, started moving up. And then she was looking at his legs. And soon enough, he crossed his waistline. And she was at his chest. And it seemed so sudden that she was standing straight and looking at his eyes. And these were probably the first eyes she's seen in years. And they stood there staring face to face, smiling, tears running down their faces. And I thought, how strange it is that I find myself envious of her. This woman that moments ago was bent and crooked, and no one would look at, no one would speak to. And now here in this moment, I find myself envious of her experience. And as they looked in each other's eyes, all I could think is, I want that. I want to know what that feels like. I want to know who this guy is. Because for some reason, he has a power and an authority like I have never seen before. And that's when the authorities spoke up. And they accused him. After he had done this amazing, miraculous thing, they accused him of healing on the Sabbath day, of breaking God's law. They were basically saying that his power was from Satan. His power was from darkness, because he was breaking God's commandments and God's laws. And all the crowd, in fear and in shame, turned our eyes away because we were afraid. But he didn't. He stood straight, and he looked his accusers in the eyes, and he said, "You hypocrites." And he said that they would feed an animal before they would feed a daughter. Did I hear it right? Did he call her a daughter? A daughter of the King? A daughter of the Most High God? How on earth did we miss what he saw so clearly? That this woman who was broken and bent and crooked for so many years, all this time, was an heir to glory. Was an inheritor of redemption and life and healing. And he knew it the instant he saw her. And we missed it. And as he accused his accusers, as he fought back against tyranny and oppression, the ones who were righteous and proud averted their eyes and couldn't dare to make eye contact with anyone because they were so ashamed. And as they looked down and they bent their necks and their backs to avoid everyone's gaze, all I could think is how they had switched places. How this woman who had spent 18 years staring at people's feet, unable to look anyone in the eye, isolated and ashamed, now stood proud and righteous and restored and renewed. And how the proud and righteous who had used their judgment to hold themselves up now stood ashamed and crooked and bent. In this one phrase, in this one act, he had turned everything around. He changed the whole world order with a simple phrase, "You're set free." And the crowd cheered. Because freedom, just like shame, permeates a crowd. The same way that people share an embarrassment, the same way that someone else's public shame touches my shame, so does life touch my heart. So does renewal and resurrection and healing permeate the crowd, and so we cheered. and we worshiped because this man had done something that only God could do. And I cheered because if he could do that for her, this woman whose shame was on the outside, my shame was in the secret places of my heart. This woman who was bent and crooked physically, that I who am bent and crooked spiritually. If he, with a word, can set her free, if he can cause her to stand, then maybe he could. Would he do that for me? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory.